Good evening, everybody. My name is Quentin McKellar. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Hertfordshire. And can I begin by saying what a really great pleasure it is to see so many of you here for this year's High Sheriff Lecture. And this year it's focusing on the social role of law and lawyers. I'd particularly like to welcome Suzy Harvey, the High Sheriff of Hertfordshire, and of course James Palmer, who will be delivering this evening's lecture. James is Chair and Senior Partner of the international law firm Herbert Smith Freehills and a friend of Suzy's for more than 25 years. As the High Sheriff, Suzy's remit within the county is to act as the Queen's representative for law and order. Perhaps we should this evening call her Ma'am. As such, though, it's a very great pleasure for the university to host a lecture given by an invitee of our High Sheriff. James has worked for Herbert Smith Freehills for over 30 years since leaving law school. He has spent 25 years involved in law reform and working with governments and regulators on the development of laws and regulation in relation to business activities. He chairs the Legal Services Group of the City UK, the body which represents the UK financial and professional services sectors. He's an advisor to the UK Financial Conduct Authority on financial regulation, a trustee of the non-party political public policy think tank Reform, and a writer and lecturer on company law and other aspects of business regulation. I'd like to welcome James Palmer to the stage. James.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, first of all, for that very warm welcome, Vice-Chancellor. That's very kind of you. And also to Penny Carey, the Dean of the Law School, and the events team for all of their help in organising this evening. And particularly to the High Sheriff, Suzy Harvey, for bravely inviting me to give this lecture. And most of all, perhaps, to all of you for coming along to give up an evening to hear some of my thoughts. I'm going to start. I'm a lawyer, so I've got to start with a disclaimer. In fact, I'm going to start with 3 because we don't do limitation. We're always taking too much time saying too much. So 3 disclaimers. The first is, I'm afraid I have nothing original to say. All of my ideas and thoughts today, this evening, have come from absorbing ideas and listening to others and reading ideas of others, and from my experience in working with governments, with businesses, but actually people and law and lawyers. But for the students here, I have to say I think picking up ideas from other people is not a bad approach. It's the only one I know. The views are not those of my colleagues at Herbert Smith Freehills. They're mine alone, and any ignorance is down to me, not anybody else in my firm. And a bit of a view that I always give, and I'm really just directing this to the students, but to everybody. One of the things I always say is just be careful how you treat advice and views. I think all advice, whoever from, but certainly including mine, should be treated as, at best, potentially useful, but certainly potentially unreliable. And one of the things I've found doing an extension of the same job and not having the imagination to do anything else for 33 years is that my ideas change and my views develop over time. And I think that is absolutely normal. And I'm absolutely sure that in another 5 years' time, some of the things I talked to you about tonight, I will realize were naive or missed a point or something like that. So take this as you find it. And if there are bits that resonate, great. But if there are bits that don't worry, you're probably right. So just to kick off, why did I want to talk about the role of law and of lawyers? Apart from self-indulgence on a subject I know a bit about. Everybody tends to talk about the rule of law, not the role of law. And I regularly open the newspapers and see a politician talking about the rule of law. And we all know that the rule of law is a good thing, as they would have said in 1066 and all that, for those who've read it. It's something that we all prize, but we're most of us not quite sure what it is. Tom Bingham, Lord Bingham, former Master of the Rolls, Lord Chief Justice and Senior Law Lord, and a seriously thoughtful lawyer, wrote an excellent book on it, and I've plugged his book there. But it's consciously not the title I've given, because I, as I'm going to explain, think the rule of law is a phrase that lawyers use and others use without completely understanding it. And I think that it is interesting to talk about the role of law, and you'll see why. So that's where we're going to go. Gripping death by detailed PowerPoint. There's worse to come. So that is what I wanted to talk about. I never studied jurisprudence. I did do a law degree, but I never studied jurisprudence. I've never studied the philosophy of law. And so, as I've already disclaimed, some of what I've said is probably going to seem a bit naive to those who've really thought deeply about it. But the one reason I'm not embarrassed to talk about it is lawyers hardly ever discuss it. And it's hardly ever discussed. And I think lawyers, as you're going to hear me say, I think sometimes think there's a latent assumption that everything they do is good because it is part of the rule of law or whatever the rationale is. And I think it's a bit more complicated than that. So I'll talk about the role of law for a bit, and then I will turn to talk much more extensively about the role of lawyers. The good news for those of you who have some views about lawyers that I'm going to come on and talk about, which are not entirely positive, is I'm not going to talk about the law at all in terms of taking you through some detailed area of law. More about the philosophy of it and actually some human aspects of it and some traits of human behavior, which are probably directed optimistically at the student attendees as much as everyone else. My simple, essential point through the lecture is we need to step back and think about the context in which the law exists. And I think that that also requires us to think about the context in which each of us, sound very metaphysical, lives our lives as lawyers and non-lawyers. And to try to keep a feel for the bigger picture, which is definitely not a universally recognized lawyer trait, or, for that matter, a trait amongst people in general. So the role of law, what should law be? So my view is that although there's very little discussion of it, most of the discussion, I've Googled away and looked at some books and things before doing this, and when you Google it, there's some absolutely hilarious things that come up, which really I don't recommend at all. But there's some quite thoughtful pieces which talk mostly about human rights law. They talk about medical ethics, but we don't tend to talk about what the law is there to do and how it should operate and what its role is. And I quite like going back to first principles whenever you analyze any subject and to try and think about that perspective in how we approach it. I think if we do not talk about the social role of law, what its purpose is, and understand that as we act as lawyers, I'm a practicing lawyer still, then I think not only do we risk losing sight of the social role, but I think we also are unable to articulate it simply and clearly, and I think we lose public trust and reputation and our own reputation. So what do I think is the social purpose of law? So I'm going to keep forgetting to do slides. The social purpose of law, to me, is look, it's a human creation. We've created laws. They're not things that were handed down for us all automatically to accept and live with forever. It's, in my view, the law should be, in any society, the rules that reflect how that society thinks it is fair to regulate human activity within that society. And we have different rules for different societies, different countries, but also different broader sets of rules, international law and so on as well. Those things that we think are so serious that society should punish them, we introduce criminal law for, and those that we think do not require the state and criminal punishment for, we introduce civil law for, and I'm using the term civil law not in the sense of European law, but all non-criminal law. And again, I think that's obvious to all the lawyers who are here, but we don't always articulate it that way. And I think whenever we regulate, whenever we see change in the law, whenever we think about what's appropriate, we should actually think about what is the role of the state in intervening here. And there are always some people in favor, some people against. My experience is Most people usually dislike all new laws, but once they're there, they're usually quite comfortable with them, unless they give rise to specific problems. So I think it is easy to get your head around what the role of law means in an area like criminal law or medical ethics or human rights, because we can relate to that. We can relate to its application to people. To give you an example, if you've got an issue, and this is always in the press, it's always in the law reports, important judgments affecting people's lives about a decision, whether a decision on a sick child is taken by the doctor, the parent, the child, or the courts, those kind of issues. And we can relate to that because we can relate to how it applies to people around us, we can relate to criminal law, and we can relate to human rights because sometimes we see things that are outrageous and we feel strongly about it. But I think this point about the law reflecting society's rules for fairness is and should be true of all areas of law, not just criminal, human rights, family, or other laws dealing with the oppressed or those without power. I think it applies to every aspect of law. So this could be self-justification for being a business lawyer, but in the area of business law, people tend to think of it as a different bucket, including some of those practicing in the area of business law. But I think it's identical. Business law is law for regulating people. We think about businesses as some intangible thing, and they are legally, because legally we say a company is a separate legal person. But a big company is just a complex legal fiction for a very, very complex group of people. Our individual pension savings, if we've got pension savings as shareholders held through myriads of complex structures that probably look rather expensive and complicated, and then you've got companies with different subsidiaries, but they're just labels to organize different groups of people. And I think when we work in areas like mine of corporate law, or any other area that is not immediately accessible to people, we've got to try and bring it back to that human connection and that role for people. And I think if we do that, people still may not relate to it, but we start to make more sense of what it's all about, or should be about, even if it isn't always about that. So I personally believe that the principle of law setting out the rules for fairness between individuals in any society should underpin everything. And I'm going to talk about some of the challenges for that. I saw a number of definitions about the role of law that said it's society's moral standard. And I don't agree with that either. I think that the law is a bottom line of when you need to have the state intervene or to allow individuals to go to the courts to intervene. But I don't think my morality, and I'm prepared to bet this is true of almost everybody, if not everybody in the room, is just what's legal. And there are people who that's all they'll test, but not most of us. Most of us have additional standards, and we approve and disapprove of things, but we don't necessarily need to make everything that we disapprove of illegal. That would be a pretty restrictive world because everybody disapproves of different things. But anyway, I think this core principle of the purpose of law is fundamental and doesn't get talked about, and it often is not that talked about in lawmaking, an area I get involved from time to time. People tend to jump into the detail very quickly. And I think, as I said, this is true whether you're talking about tax, corporate law, family law, property ownership, whatever it might be. Just to sort of finish the debate about what is the role of law, let's look at the counterfactual. What happens if you don't have law? If you have no law, my view is you look at societies without law, and they default to control through, the positive perception of it, control through trust, relationships of trust, and in reality, to be more realistic about it, through power, violence, patronage, corruption, and reliance on connections. So if we treat that as the counterfactual, which I think is borne out by societies. Societies create their own laws, those that don't have formal courts and so on. They all create their own systems and laws and rules. But imagine if you don't have those, imagine if you've got no enforcement. That is the counterfactual, is that it is dependence on those things. There's nobody to turn to for the protections and rights we take for granted. So I think, again, to be a bit evangelical about it, that the law enables human trust and engagement between those in a society, whether they know each other or not. And I think, just to pause on that, that is a fantastic thing. And I think some of you are sitting saying, well, that's blindingly obvious, isn't it? Well, again, I don't think people talk about it enough. And so I'm not convinced it is always blindingly obvious. And I'm very happy to say very bluntly that I think the political understanding today of the importance of the role of law is at a bit of a low ebb, actually. I'm not saying it's out of control, but it's definitely patchy. So I think to try and, this is my positive spin doctor for the law bit, but I think the law should provide that value to support human engagement and trust. And I think in many cases it does. How does that tie in with lawmaking? Well, I'll come back to that. I'm going to keep coming back to context, meaning what does this mean in a broader context throughout this talk. And I don't think law can be looked at in a vacuum. I often meet lawyers who think that everything revolves around the law. And they're passionate about it and they see the good of it. And by the way, this is not just lawyers. If we look in the mirror, it's most of us about whatever we do. We tend to think it's very, very important because we see the benefits. It's not just we're self-important, we're steeped in the advantages and benefits of what each of us does. We're not always so good at thinking about the advantages and benefits of what others do or the proportionality of the importance for us. So I think that the view that justice is about applying the law and finding the right answer is often a lawyer view. I regularly go to meetings with lawyers who say, I don't think we should comment on that point. We're talking about some proposed new law or regulation. We shouldn't comment on that point. That's policy. That's for the politicians. And not for us. We're just the lawyers there to say what the law should be and deal with the technical things. And I think dealing with the technical things is important, but I don't think it's the whole picture. I think some of this perspective as to why we don't think about the policy issues in law comes from the way in which we are taught law and we learn law. And it comes from the role of the judiciary, because the judiciary's got a different role from most other lawyers. The judiciary need to be seen to be impartially applying the law. Trust in our judges is high. And actually to achieve that trust, you need to know they're going to give you the answer that is provided for by the law, not just their answer. And that's what they do. And when you are a law student and you read legal judgments, they're scrupulous about steering clear of policy issues and saying this is a matter for Parliament and so on. And I think we imbue this. And I actually think it isn't just a matter for Parliament, because I can tell you that there are people in Parliament who understand to a very sophisticated degree policy issues and new legislative proposals, but I can also tell you without, frankly, really criticising politicians any more than is blindingly obvious, that most of them don't have a clue. And how could they? Because the law's got more and more complex and more technical. So I think that the law's detachment from policy, part of that sense of independence, has not helped us to articulate the role of law and the role of lawyers. And I think that we should engage more in the policy debate, whatever our views may be, and not hold back from it. And I think attention to detail, which is a key characteristic of lawyers, you know, you don't really want to go to a lawyer. I once had a trainee who was a lovely, lovely guy who said to me at the end of his 6 months working for me, and I said, what do you fancy doing? And I'd given him some feedback that perhaps he needed to focus a bit more on some of the detail because his advice was quite regularly wrong and I needed to correct it. And he said, James, I see myself being a bit more of a big picture lawyer than a details lawyer. And I thought, well, okay, that's not looking good. But actually, we want people who'll do both. And I think that is the theme that's going to run through this. And of course, some will be stronger in one area than the other. Just also to set the scene before I talk about lawyers and the role of lawyers, is the law inherently socially positive and useful? Because we come at it in this country as if it is. And we assume the rule of law is this great thing. And that's why politicians trot it out. Just to state another obvious point, it's, as I warned you, a lecture of obvious points. The law, as I've already said, is created by people. People are imperfect, so laws are imperfect. People can do terrible things, and therefore so can laws. And I'm going to digress on something that some of you will know. In November 1932, in free democratic elections in Germany, Hitler's National Socialist Party took 32% of the vote. On 30th January 1933, a couple of months later, Hitler was appointed head of the new coalition government by von Hindenburg, the then 85-year-old state president, as head of a coalition government. 2 days later, on 1st February, Hitler asked the state president to dissolve the Reichstag, the parliament, for the third time in less than 9 months to hold another election. On the 4th of February, a few days later, and before the election, a decree was passed by the parliament, perfectly lawful, for discrimination against the two main opposition parties on the left, eradicating them. The police at that stage in Prussia under Goering and throughout Germany stopped acting against Nazi violence. There was no enforcement. On 27th February, less than a month after Hitler came in, the Reichstag was set on fire and blamed on the communists, and on 28th February, a decree was passed, 28th February 1933, suspended civil liberties under the Weimar Constitution for the purpose of combating communist acts of violence threatening the state. Even though in the election that had been called in March 1933, the Nazis still only won 43% of the vote, they were able to push through by the required 2/3 majority the Enabling Act, the infamous Enabling Act, which removed all remaining constitutional protections and vested all power in the leadership. Lawful opposition was outlawed. On 7th April 1933, the first anti-Jewish legislation, non-Aryan legislation was passed, requiring non-Aryan civil servants to retire. The decrees continued, we know what followed. But the law was ostensibly properly followed. So just remember that as we think about how perfect the law is. And law is used by despots all the time. Of course, in an established democracy like ours, we have other safeguards, and politicians can still be elected out of power, providing greater stability and fairness. And out of the Nazi era, an interesting counterpoint to that chilling story is this extraordinary generation of great Jewish jurists who came in particular to the UK, but also to the US, who really developed international law. And anybody here who's read Philippe Sand's East-West Street, a very thoughtful and moving book about the development of the law of genocide and the law of crimes against humanity, can see what a reaction that was to try and overcome despotic power and to be able to challenge it. So even in my lifetime, and I know there's lots of people here thinking, I hope he looks quite young, and a lot of people thinking he looks very old. But even in my lifetime, the social changes enacted through law have been absolutely dramatic. In 1967, homosexuality was decriminalized. Only in 2000 was the ban on LGBT citizens serving in the armed forces lifted, and in 2014, same-sex civil marriage. 1965, we had the Race Relations Act, which outlawed race discrimination, but how many people remember that it only prohibited it in public places? And the extension, it was then extended in 1968 and 76 to provide fuller protections. And whatever our political views, these are now embedded social norms in this country. And different people have different views on the spectrum at the margins, but this is the law. There's no debate about challenging these laws. We think they're normal and right. And if you're young and you don't remember the days before those laws, you think that everybody older than you must have been a bigot to have allowed those old laws. Well, I'm going to challenge everybody a little bit around this. And I think those discriminations which existed, which I think are infringements of basic human rights, and I regard those legislative changes as part of the really fundamental developments of human rights that we've seen in the last 50 years in the UK. It's my own view. But people did tolerate those old laws, and they thought they were normal, but I'm prepared to bet those who were adversely affected by them didn't think they were okay. Majorities may have thought they were okay, but not necessarily everyone does. And another challenge we see in this current world is another example of an area of law, of social impact where the law hadn't intervened and now does, is modern slavery. Slavery is an issue. You've all read about it in the newspapers and heard about it. And only in 2015 was the Modern Slavery Act passed to give far greater powers to control trafficking of people in slavery. This is a great example of the law changing to recognize social challenge that we need to address And it's a subject that I mention specifically because I know it is close to the heart of the High Sheriff, who some of you, but not all of you, will know before taking on her role spent a year back at university studying criminology to complete a master's degree focused on modern slavery so she could use her role to support outcomes in combating modern slavery. This all extends beyond human and civil rights into specialist areas in my own area, and don't worry, I'm not going to take you through a whole load of examples of business law, company law, financial services law. There are laws that I think are pretty ridiculous, that I don't think have any social purpose, but still sit there. So why does this happen? Well, I've already mentioned a bit of a concern about politicians' understanding, particularly with the complexity we now have in law. One of the reasons we have so much complexity is every time we see a problem, we think, let's change the law to fix the problem. The law is only one of the tools for fixing problems. And I think that it's the easiest one for a politician to use because you can get something done, you can put it on the statute book, box ticked, I did something about this problem. But at times that is wise, and I think those examples of legislation that I've given are exactly in that category of ones that I think are wise and have had social benefit and proportionate and thoughtful. But it isn't always the case. A lot of new legislation is knee-jerk, and it's about superficial policy commitments rather than substantively thinking about the social impact. And just as I think lawyers should think about social impact, hang on a second, the lawyers are implementing the laws and advising on the laws, and the judges are adjudicating on them, created by the politicians. And we can be cynical about politicians, and I think justifiably so in many cases, but actually in lawmaking, they're usually trying to do something sensible and constructive, but the speed at which things go through, the complexity means that some things are not proportionate and not well thought through. And that carries social cost. And I think it also builds complexity, and I think it also leads to remoteness of law, which doesn't do the law any social favors. Now, society is becoming more complicated, and I will come on and talk about that in a moment. But I think that lawyers do need to engage in these debates, but I think we need to make sure that when we do have new laws, we don't create more silos. Again, another subject I'll come back to. I had a discussion years ago with a civil servant over a piece of law, and they tabled for comment to a small group of us a proposal that they had for some new legislation, and they'd been working on it for 7 or 8 months. And we said, but you don't need to do it, it's already covered by this law, which was regulated by a completely different department. And to be fair to them, there's so much law and it's so complicated now, these challenges arise more often. So with these challenges, I don't mean to demean the law, I'll come on to that in a minute, which I do deeply believe in, but I think being honest and rational about it to help ensure we stay relevant, effective and useful is important. I also think we shouldn't lose sight, as we focus on the weaknesses of the law, about the fact that it is a mechanism to balance human frustration. Sometimes we just want someone to have heard our view, to know that we've had an opportunity to state our position, and if someone adjudicates that that actually isn't what the law wants, people will often abide by that and very often feel a level of satisfaction, even if it hasn't gone their way. I don't want to get carried away and say always, but sometimes. I think we as a society accept the system, imperfections and all, and agree to abide by it, because the alternative of lawlessness that I've described earlier is so much worse. And then we could think, well, I don't like those ones, so I won't worry about those ones, it's the other ones I like. But that doesn't work, does it? Because if we don't abide by the laws then that we don't like, what about other people not abiding by the ones that protect us? I think we need to take it in the round. So my opening comments about the law is it's human, it's imperfect, but it establishes a basis for human engagement and trust and social improvement, and should aim to do so. Gripping next slide. There we go. How positive is the perception of law and lawyers? Well, let's look at this through the public's eyes and start with lawyers. Let's face it, lawyers as a group are not particularly well regarded by the public, though often very well regarded by themselves. Judges do much better, although they were getting some challenge, some constructive challenge in the Times over the last couple of months for the question of bullying in courts by judges who have lost sight of the impact they're having on people. Here are some of the good things that I think lawyers do. Protecting the innocent wrongly accused of crimes. This is in public perception. Here we go. Now, the slides are age-defining, with apologies to all those under 50. This is an elderly gentleman called Paul Newman, who was an actor some of us remember very well, as a character called Frank Galvin. He's a struggling, flawed individual with a one-man band law practice about to fold, and he takes on a case fighting for the deeply wronged individual, fighting the big corporate villains, advised by a big corporate law firm for a just cause. So he's clearly a good guy. Here we go. Bridget Jones is true love, maybe a bit stuck up and conceited and pedantic because he is a lawyer, but he's a human rights lawyer. So we immediately know that he's a hero. He does good things. Our judges also are clearly widely trusted, and there's very positive perception around that. And joking aside, human rights clearly is an area where law is valued. In America, things are even worse than here. A 2013 survey I found in America showed that lawyers came bottom in a survey with about 30 different categories of people in society in terms of perceived contribution to society's well-being. Here in the UK, in a 2016 survey, YouGov survey, 33% of the public had little or no knowledge, meaning understanding about what lawyers do. Hard to feel useful if that's the case. 42% only of the public trusted lawyers to tell the truth. In a 2018 survey, things were looking up. 42% had moved to 45% of lawyers are trusted by the public, or of the public trust lawyers, rather. And a similar result in the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index, which ranks different categories. Now, the good news for lawyers is that is miles ahead of politicians, journalists, and estate agents. But it is quite a long way below the person in the street. So the thesis is you trust the average person you meet in the street more than you trust a lawyer. Business leaders were also lower, and as a business leader, I probably get a bit of a demotion again on that ground. The Dean and Vice-Chancellor will be delighted to hear that professors score very highly, and I think vets do even better. Look, there are loads of these surveys, and the trend goes back years, and many of you will remember the Shakespeare line from Henry VI, Part 2. Dick the Butcher says, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers in Jack Cade's Revolt. And in fact, I found, just to sort of reinforce the validity of the joke, I found an article online by an earnest lawyer explaining that Shakespeare is justifying the social importance of lawyers, because the fact that the rebels wanted to kill all the lawyers was a sign that to undermine society they needed to remove the lawyers to have I mean, God, get a life, honestly. I mean, you know, it's having a dig at lawyers, and it was a joke. Another good one-liner on it, Ambrose Bierce in his Devil's Dictionary defines a lawyer as one skilled in the circumvention of the law. So what are some of the weaknesses of lawyers in the eyes of the public? Protectors of the powerful or the established order, including at the expense of justice. Expensive and unpredictably expensive. Bureaucratic and inefficient. Focused on detail, not substance. I'm going to keep going. You probably can't all read this, so I'll read it out. So the cartoon says this charming chap chatting up the lady saying, I am a member of the legal profession, but I'm not a lawyer in the pejorative sense. And to keep running, I promise there aren't too many of these. I'm not quite ready to order. My lawyers are still studying the menu. You have a pretty good case, Mr. Pitkin. How much justice can you afford? Poor man. And work-life balance, corporate law firms, all that. Come in on Sunday for our next work-life balance seminar. Fabulous. But we all know that there's always a ring of truth in some of these points. And the bad news is your speaker, who you've allowed in through the door this evening, is part of a group which deserves a special ranking in this category of terrible lawyers, a corporate lawyer. Anyway, you all chose to come, so thank you. Here we go, corporate lawyers. So for those who remember Pretty Woman, again, old film, this is Richard Gere's evil hatchet man, corporate lawyer who's a sexual harasser and generally ghastly individual, a typical M&A lawyer. That's what I've spent much of my career doing. And then here's the real thing, The Firm. Tom Cruise, again, this is history for these students, but for some of us it was late in our careers. And Tom Cruise, Mitch McDear, joins Berdini, Lambert and Locke, full of evil mafiosi, this veneer of corporate law. So those are some cheap shots about the position of the profession and how it's looked at. But I think there is a point there. So how do we match the esteem for the rule of law and parts of what we do as lawyers with the dismay and distrust for other parts? Well, I think it is quite complicated, and I'm going to focus really on human context. My central thesis is that everything about law, its creation, application, and how lawyers fulfill their roles, just to repeat the point, needs to be based in the relevant human context. In fact, I don't think that just applies to law. I think that applies to everything anyone does in any organization or any role. But I'm more qualified to talk about law. So to turn a bit more constructively to how to be a good lawyer, or more importantly, how to use the skills of legal training, because not every law student goes on and becomes a lawyer, most effectively and with the greatest sense of fulfillment and achievement, we need to talk a bit more openly about people and what people are like. So a few aspects of how we work, and there are a few themes to draw out. Lawyers are very focused on expertise. They're very focused on technical detail. That's something they take pride in. If you are an expert, that is a great thing, but it can also mean that you become siloed and isolated in your view and have tunnel vision or even tribalism as to how you view issues. One thing we have to remember is that the expertise of lawyers and the law is not necessarily the most important priority. In fact, it's not the priority for most people most of the time. The law is socially important, but it's not top of what everyone else is doing every day when they go to work or look after their children or whatever they do. Not only is law not the most important thing to most people most of the time, even when it is relevant, it's often just one piece of a bigger picture. And again, I think we lose sight of this often. I think one other theme that we're facing is the increased complexity of the world. I alluded to this earlier. Keep going. And I think that when I started over 30 years ago, I tended to go to a meeting as a very junior lawyer, often on my own, and I'd meet 2 or 3 people and we'd have a contract that I started in the days when contract marks up, you sent the contract round and it was typed in different colored inks. A long contract might be 15 pages long. Now we've got thousands of pages of data and disclosures, and the complexity is unbelievable. The law is far more voluminous. And I think technological and scientific and social developments have made us far more interconnected with far more people, many of whom we don't know anymore. So the law is trying to cover a more complex social structure. And I think that creates challenges for us all as well. And I think that the only way to deal with that complexity is through teaming. And I think that some people sometimes do things that only requires them, but most activities in society require multiple inputs. And therefore the skill of thinking about people and human dynamic and how you team is fundamental. A few thoughts on people, and I'm going to start on motivation. I wonder what the students here currently think they want to do, want to achieve in their lives. Not just in your careers, but in your personal lives too. You'll all have different views and different perspectives on that. But each of us is influenced by the experiences we've had. And if you're anything like me, those views will evolve during your life and during your career in relation to work. And I think it's inevitable that each of us is changed by our experiences. And as we know that happens to each of us, it's worth remembering that it happens to everybody else as well. And not everybody's had the same experiences, is a blindingly obvious statement. But I think the more you think about how people's positions are the products of their experiences, the easier it is to get past anger or frustration with something you disagree with and try and understand why someone has that position and not get angry about it, look at it in a human context, realize it's perfectly understandable that they've reached that view. You think it's completely wrong, you think it's socially inappropriate, whatever it might be, but we think about that. I can assure you that I had, the only thing I was clear of at the stage of studying law was that I didn't want to be a lawyer. So things change. I'm also going to talk quickly about motivation, because I think that there are a lot of myths that are propagated about what motivates people, and a lot of assumptions made that are blindingly, obviously foolish. There's a guy called Dan Pink who wrote a book called Drive about motivation, and he did a TED Talk, which I sort of my level, which for those of you who don't know, TED Talks is an internet site doing really quite insightful speeches and worth looking at. And Dan Pink on motivation, he's an academic who studied it for years, and he looked at what motivated people who wanted some cognitive involvement in their work, weren't just doing a purely functional role. And I'm not just talking about lawyers, I'm talking about everyone from PAs to receptionists to IT people, most people in this society. And what he found was that people were not motivated by money. And I always give this speech to our associates when we're about to negotiate pay rises. But I think he's right. I think money is a factor because it gives us choices, and I'd never demean money as a motivator. I know people who are caring for disabled family members and so on, and the money makes a huge difference to the care they can get and so on, and that's really fundamental to them. But most people work in his research for three main buckets, and they're his labels, not mine. One of them is what he calls autonomy, a desire to have a degree of control and input into our lives. Secondly, what he calls mastery, the desire to develop some skill that we're proud of, that we become good of, and we can exercise with satisfaction. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, he talks about purpose. And I think in one of his talks or books, he describes it as something like the desire to do something useful with others, not just for ourselves. And I think it's obvious. And I help lead an organization with nearly 5,000 staff. And I can tell you, most of them are motivated by these things. And I think that we often think everyone in business is only motivated by money, and it's clearly not true. And I think, again, if we acknowledge it, we can have more sensible conversations. There's a great Gallup survey on 12 great things, or 12 things that make for a great workplace. My favorite one is, does someone at work care about you as a person? I don't think I would have stayed in my job for 33 years if I hadn't, through my career, certainly the first 15 years or so as I was rising to get to more experience, if people who I worked for hadn't been interested in me and cared about me. And I think that's a very important characteristic, which, as we engage in the law, is worth thinking about as well. I think these things apply to all personality types, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. There's not one type. And one other human characteristic I want to just quickly focus on is what leads to people achieving fulfillment in their careers. Because if you are running social structures, you're creating social infrastructure, which is what law is, running an institution, whether it's an academic institution, a law firm, a small business, it doesn't matter what it is. These are things worth thinking about. And again, just to stick with my, to start highbrow and then go to my level, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, wrote extensively about human happiness and human nature and so on. And his general thesis is that until you work out that the world is awful and human beings can do terrible things, you can't enjoy life because your expectations are mismatched from reality. That's not an excuse for the bad things, but it's honest. Human beings are flawed. And I think acknowledging that without criticism is an important attribute in how we engage with people, whether as lawyers or others, because I see lawyers treating somebody who doesn't know as much of them as them as if they're a fool. Well, why would you do that? It's part of your job is to try to know more than them. That's your expertise, but you might as well still treat them with respect. And not knowing things is not a flaw. Not knowing things is just what you've learnt and experienced. The US academic researcher Brené Brown has written on this and again done internet talks on it. And she studied for years shame, and she also studied what led to human beings achieving their personal goals in life, which is a pretty big and important subject. And she studied it for years and years and years. And some of you may know the talk, including some of those who've had to sit next to me in dinner in the last 3 years since I saw it. And she found that it was a lot to do with vulnerability. And there's a TED talk called The Power of Vulnerability. And again, some of you are thinking, this sounds like sort of, mumbo-jumbo nonsense sort of, management speak. But it isn't, it's researched. She found that there's one defining characteristic as to whether people achieve their personal goals in life, which is whether they have feelings of self-worth, whether they're comfortable in their own skin, whether they're comfortable with themselves. And to be comfortable with themselves, they had to be comfortable with not being perfect. And I think so much of society, and we all talk about the internet, but it's not just the internet, it's businesses. It's needing to show your boss you haven't made a mistake, needing not to let slip to your friends that you forgot something or other, or you put your foot in it. And I think there's a desire to present veneers that are not the reality. And the research is showing that the people who achieve contentment, fulfillment, their goals, are the people who've got over that. And that, I think, is also worth remembering. And the really interesting data point in her detailed research is that the percentages of people are identical through every slice of society. And for the really clever lawyers who work with me, it's a bit distressing for them to discover that being very clever has absolutely no impact on your feelings of self-worth. So the cleverest group have just as many divisions as any other. And I think these things are worth thinking about because they teach us how to engage with people when we fulfill our roles and we think about law. Let's be careful how we judge them. Let's not hold back from judging if we think society needs to intervene, but let's look at it in those terms. But I do think all organizations and lawyers trying to be respected should remember that we should value ourselves, and I think one of the reasons I talk about the role of law is so we can engage in it in a way we're proud of, and people can then be proud of it, and people can respect the law, and I think that has social advantage for everyone, given the importance of the law. Think about who you admire, and think about who you trust. We admire and trust people who we have a connection with. Do you trust someone who claims to be perfect? I don't. And therefore, just think about it when we're holding back about some mistake we made. Are we reducing trust? Are we actually reducing human connection, which is a driver of fulfillment, research shows, for people? And again, I don't think we teach people this when they start their careers or what other activities they're going to engage with, but it seems to me pretty fundamental. And how do you judge it? How do you judge people who make mistakes? Do you belittle them? Do you make them feel fools? Or do you encourage them to be open so they can learn more? And I don't get it right all the time, but if you think about it at least, you can change the culture, I think. And I think that you can be more respected, because I think we all respect people who are like that. So I think for lawyers in particular, trust is vital. And I think a lot of lawyers think you should never admit weakness. And they think they're serving their client. Don't apologize. If you apologize, they'll sue you and you'll lose in court. Well, I don't know about that, actually. I mean, if you really definitely did the thing, it'll probably come out in court anyway. And an awful lot of things are fixed by some human recognition. Now, there's a bunch of litigators somewhere here getting very twitchy about this. But I'm afraid if we mess up on things, I think it's our job to hold our hands up on it. Because I think trust is more important than trying to duck one challenge. In fact, it usually gets you into a deeper hole anyway. Understanding differences of how human brains process, how each of us has developed through different experiences. I think this is the thing I've learned the most about in the last 10 years. If you get a leadership role in a big law firm these days, they don't send you on the Mr. Evil course, but they do send you to be analyzed intensively by every conceivable psychological expert. And the one thing I've learned from that is how different people are, how differently their brains function. And before we dismiss someone who doesn't communicate like us or doesn't approach an issue like us, they're just being normal. That's normal. All human beings categorize in different ways as to how their brains process. Respect for others and kindness. I'm going to just wrap up with a few themes here. Look, you get the gist of it. I think that how we engage with people as lawyers really matters, because if we want to be respected, we need to respect. And I think that I won't ask for show of hands, but I bet lots of you in the last 2 weeks have followed the story of Tony Foulds, the man from Sheffield, who for years has been polishing a war memorial to American servicemen killed in the war. And I can tell you, I respect him, and I think what he did is fantastic. He just did something human and kind and respectful to others. And that's the sort of thing we value. So why would you not do that? Why would we not do that as in our rush to our expertise or the job that we think we're tasked with, when actually I think we're tasked with a much broader responsibility? My father gave me lots of good advice, as did my mother, but my father, there's 2 quotes I'm going to mention here. When I was about 17, I said to him that I was, he said, have you seen X, who was the son of someone he knew who was at school with me or something? I said, oh no, Dad, he's really boring. And he got quite irritated with me, and he said, boring is what arrogant people say about people who are quieter than them. I wouldn't have minded if you had told me you had not yet found out what was interesting about him. And the other saying he had was, I remember him saying years ago, when you're dead, what will the person who you bought your newspaper from every morning say about you? Will he say, don't remember him, oh, that grumpy bloke, oh, that lovely, cheerful chap who was always friendly? Small acts of kindness make a big difference, and they change cultures. So just to wrap this up, as we're hitting the time, I know we started a few minutes late, so I'm encroaching into the Q&A time, but I think we've got to think about social impact of law. I think we do need to engage in thinking about the policy of law, not treat it as a sacred cow that is not to be touched, not just stick to what we know, be open to change. I think that for the students and others looking at what you're going to do in your careers, just do your best, do what you can. I don't think it's easy to feel proud of what you do if you haven't tried at it. I've never felt proud of anything that I didn't try at. But don't worry if it's not perfect. There's always somebody cleverer, somebody better looking, somebody better at sport, in my case, almost everybody on those ones. And you just got to go with it, because in fact, go back to what I'm saying about who we value, those aren't really the things we value. The things we value are some of the human characteristics I'm talking about, whatever we do. Be interested in people. So I started off by saying we don't really know what the rule of law is, and I was going to talk about the role of law. I actually think this is what the rule of law is about. I think it is about the social purpose of law, but we don't articulate it very clearly, and I think this is the core of why judges and other lawyers are passionate about the rule of law. But I think they use that phrase, which to me is a bit jargony. So I'm going to finish with a quote from a book which was sent to me by a wise friend who was a very kind mentor to me early in my career, not a lawyer, but someone involved in public policy. After I had dinner with him 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I discussed this talk and some of the views, and he was beginning to yawn, and he said, he sent me this book, and it's by a young barrister, young relative to me, called Sarah Langford. And it's called In Your Defence. And in her book, she very movingly describes 11 cases that she's dealt with as a junior barrister, and they're very human, and the context is palpable in each of them, and they're very thoughtful and empathetic, but not sort of all mushy one way or another. They're just honest about the different challenges and issues. She says, towards the end of her book, in her conclusions, the decisions made in courts across our country touch our daily lives somehow, no matter how far removed we think we might be or whether we notice. Our ability to buy and sell and to invest are made possible by a legal system that is trusted to enforce a contract fairly. From the cost of our insurance to our ability to hold our government and its institutions to account, good and bad decisions by the law reach us all in the end. The law seems removed because archaic rituals and language of the courtroom belie the fact that our legal system is a living thing, and I think some of those other factors I've talked about. It deals with the most contemporary problems of society, reflecting society back at itself. This is why everyone should have an interest in protecting what we know our justice system can do at its best. The law is human justice, designed and enforced. It will therefore always be imperfect. It makes mistakes. It is slow, sometimes chaotic, sometimes illogical. It cracks and at times crumbles, but it remains a pillar upon which our country is founded. Were it to break, the stability of our nation would break too, and we would be all the poorer for it. I could not agree more. Thank you all very much.
James, thank you very much for what has been an enormously reflective and interesting lecture. Now, I'm delighted to say that James has agreed to take some questions. So the floor is now open. If you wouldn't mind, when you ask your question, yes, I see one up there, if you just give your name and tell us what your occupation is, just so that we can rule out the lawyers.
Yes, thank you for a very amusing lecture. My name is Tony McAllister. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a member of the public. But on my way here tonight, I was thinking about lawyers and the law, and my favourite quote comes from Pretty Woman, and I was amused to see your slide from that film. But it's when Julia Roberts, the hooker, is talking to Richard Gere, trying to guess what his occupation is, and she says, "I think you're a lawyer." "Why do you think I'm a lawyer?" She says, "I don't know, you have that sharp, useless look about you." But I hope you'll excuse that joke at your expense.
If I'd spotted it, I'd have used it.
But I do have a question, which is you talk about the law helping people to engage and to foster trust. We're all familiar with companies which get into deep financial trouble. Yeah. And they go into receivership, and the directors leave the company and walk down the road a few weeks later and set up another company. And I'm sure I'm not alone thinking that can't be right. Why is it legal for them to do that?
So I'm not an insolvency law expert, but I know a little bit about this. There are actually some law reform proposals going through government at the moment looking at changing some of the aspects of that. And the issue has been raised. I mean, the theory is that if you're trying to get money for creditors, that if you can get some money for the business from somebody, then you might as well sell it to somebody rather than sell it to nobody and get nothing for the creditors. But I think that has been a long-standing policy debate about whether it is fair or unfair. And certainly if you think people are doing it as a way of dropping the debts and just carrying on being paid, it seems to me that's one of the reasons it has been questioned quite hard. And it's one of the reasons the UK hasn't followed the US approach of bankruptcy law in some respects, which in some ways is regarded as better at saving businesses, but in other ways at increasing that problem. But it's a valid question. I don't have a great answer, I'm afraid.
Good evening. Richard Thake, Chairman of the Hertfordshire County Council. I have a very simple question for you. As an estate agent turned politician, can I ever be forgiven?
Well, I reckon I'm up there as a corporate lawyer and business leader, so we can both struggle together. There's a question down.
One behind in here, and then I've got one down, Rodney, down at the front here.
Hi there, down here at the front. Luke Harrison, I'm a partner at a firm called Debenhams Ottaway, and I also chair the Commercial Litigation Association, so a lawyer and a litigator, I'm afraid. The question I've got for you is really about accessibility of the law. I always think of the law as bullets and lawyers as the guns that fire those bullets. And I think now it's more acute than ever that members of society are finding it very difficult to access the law. A couple of very simple examples of late. There was a reported decision a couple of days ago about Joe Moylan, QC, who tried to obtain an order preventing Uber from claiming £1 million worth of costs against him, so a protective costs order in what is his VAT tribunal application over a £1.07 VAT receipt that he's after. But essentially the benefit of the litigation has been brought for public benefit, and the order was refused, obviously creating a real problem in him continuing with the litigation because he faces a potential £1 million bill for costs if he loses. So there's one example there. The other example is from a non-contentious sort of corporate law scenario, which is contractual estoppel clauses that you often find in contracts, particularly in contracts with banks and financial institutions, that say, whatever we've told you about the deal we're doing, actually the contract will sort of rewrite history. And when businesses are entering into those sort of contracts and are not necessarily advised, it can have significant consequences. So I suppose the question is really about what can be done in your view to increase the ability of members of society to access the law, those members who don't have deep pockets.
So I think that it's a huge issue. I'm not going to comment on your specifics. I've got through the whole talk without actually talking about any technical areas of law, and I'm going to try and stick to that. But I think that access to justice is a massive problem. And I actually gave an interview to a newspaper about 14 years ago to the Times talking about this. I completely agree, because I know that I probably wouldn't go to court on anything unless it was absolutely fundamental to me, because it's not easy. And we've got, I was going to put up a slide, there's a cartoon I found of the judge leaning over to his clerk in court saying, this is this very prosperous businessman standing there in the relevant case, and he's clearly wearing a beautiful suit with a gold watch and things like that, and the judge is leaning to his clerk saying, will you please pass me the law for the rich? and I think that there is a huge danger that we've got a legal system that is only accessible for certain people. Clearly, part of the point I'm trying to make about thinking about human context is to think about, I mean, I was cantering through the criticisms of law, but one of the ones I mentioned at pace was it's there to protect the powerful, not the ordinary. And I think that is a real issue. I mean, I won't comment on the two specifics, but I think that there are some really big questions. There's a huge program going on of increased use of technology to replace courts, to facilitate things. I know that most of the lawyers here will probably disagree with me. I think there are questions about whether the adversarial system is an appropriate system in parts of our justice system, needing two lawyers to argue either side of points. You know, continental system is much more one investigating magistrate or judge looks at things. There are some arguments for it. I know it's not our system. I know it's foreign, it's anathema, but you know, there are some arguments about it. So I think it is a huge issue. We know the funding has affected it. I think that the cost of law for ordinary people, I think lawyers share some responsibility for that in the courts as well. I think we all do. As a profession, that search for perfection, that risk of being criticised in the Court of Appeal, whatever it is, I think people just address far more issues than are important. So, you know, I'm nervous because this is being videoed and my litigation colleague or corporate colleague will watch it. But I mean, sometimes I ask a colleague for a 2-page memo about some point that a client who I'm involved with is, and I get 17 pages. And I will, you know, try and refuse to look at it and say, you've got to be able to distill things down. And I think that applies through the justice system generally. I don't have an easy answer. There is quite a lot of focus on it. I think so wearing my City UK role, and I'm not here to represent City UK tonight, I do engage with Ministry of Justice and the Chancellor and the Judiciary on legal policy, and there is support for it. And I think the current Lord Chancellor is actually a lot more supportive than some of his predecessors have been. But it is a gaping issue, and my dig at political lack of understanding of the importance of the role of law is really designed to try and increase social focus. And Sarah Langford's comment about the pillars falling away is about your point, that if you don't have access to the law, then it's irrelevant, you're not protected by it, and we've just failed. So I completely agree with the challenge.
Rodney.
Rodney Day, Dean of the School of Engineering and Computer Science. You spoke at quite length this evening often about complexity of law. So my question really is the law complex because it's good for lawyers? Or is it just inherently complex? Or should we put some effort into making it more straightforward?
It's a great question, and as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned in his introduction, I've spent 25 years dabbling at the fringes with government on legal policy, and hand on heart, one of my absolute passions is for simplicity and less detail. I don't think that the complexity of the law is a product of greedy lawyers thinking, let's make it more complicated. I don't think it's that, because you need Parliament or a regulator to introduce the law, not the lawyers. So I don't think it's that. But I think the obsession with detail, the fear of being wrong, that both of which I talked about, are part of this. So I sit in a group that advises our financial regulator, and I used to sit in a group with more lawyers, and sometimes people would say, we need a new rule on this because it's unclear about this circumstance. And you can see, if it is a bit unclear, you can see that somebody doesn't want to take the risk of being in trouble and breach of law, so they want more clarity, but you can just keep going. You just keep going. And my first law lecture at university, the lecturer stood up and he said, ladies and gentlemen, he was a criminal lecturer, ladies and gentlemen, it's first morning, a little bit fresh-faced and clueless, and he said, you're joining the law at a terrible, terrible time, terrible time. And he then said, here, and he held up one slim volume, is the entire statutory output of the United Kingdom in 1881, 100 years before. And here, and he held 3 fat volumes, is the entire statutory output of 1981. Isn't it a disgrace? Well, I tell you what, from 1981 to now, we've got on skates. Because every year now, if you look at the law, the rules, it isn't all Brussels. This is a non-political Brexit comment, but it's not all Brussels, it's mostly us. And it's just volumes. I mean, financial regulation alone. We've got handbooks, the FCA handbook is enormous. I mean, it's just, and what happens is that the lawyers, it's so complicated, the human brain can only cope with some of it. And so then you have these specialists who think of more and more problems in their area, and that area is the most important thing to them, and they quite rightly identify some point, and someone goes, oh gosh, I need my backside covered about that, we better have a law. And so I think it just gets this momentum, and I think that there's quite a lot of research into the social cost in financial services of regulation. Now, this is often taken as an argument for deregulation. Let's go back to the old days when there was no regulation and banks could happily go bust. You know, we clearly don't approve of that. But I think there is a point about the cost. I mean, we've got all age demographics in the audience, but I remember getting some shares from my elderly grandmother in the early 1980s, not worth very much, but a little bit. And she'd bought them, she'd paid 1 commission to buy them, and then there was no other cost on the shares. Now, you probably have them held through a fund, you buy or sell them with a spread on it, they're probably invested through a fund of funds, and you've got all these layers. And in theory, the layers are there to segregate the roles, to avoid conflicts, but they're creating cost. And pension returns in this country are below pension returns in the Netherlands solely because of cost. And some of that comes from regulation, and these are issues that I think we need to look at. So I think it isn't just lawyers. I think a lot of it is the politicians legislating because it's easier to create a new law than to change the underlying management of the issue that needs changing. I do think there's a bias in favour of legislation.
Now, I had one down here. In fact, I've got 2 down here and 1 up the back, and then I'm going to invoke Chairman's prerogative and ask one myself and then pass on to Suzy.
Far away. Yeah.
So Richard first, yeah.
Richard Walduck, retired hotelier and farmer. Former magistrate too. King Edward III banned all lawyers from sitting as members of Parliament. Any thoughts?
Well, we actually have the lowest proportion of lawyers in public roles of any society in the Western world. Most others have many more, so maybe some of his inclination has followed through historically in the UK. Well, it won't surprise you that I'm not a complete fan of that, given the risk you have when a lot of the parliamentary role is creating legislation, and legislation is law. And I'm afraid it hasn't been my experience that legislation created by non-lawyers is always better, but I think there is this point about lawyers making a meal of things, which is true. But just again, to be a little bit fair to the lawyers in the audience, an awful lot of people make a meal of whatever their favourite thing is, whatever they do. So I think that's human nature a bit.
One right up at the back there.
Ian Piggott, I'm a farmer. I'm intrigued by, you've touched on this quite a lot already, but you speak about the rule of law. In 2014, the Department of Education introduced 5 values that all school children have a duty to learn, and one of those is the rule of law. Now, if you think it's jargony and misunderstood, what hope have they? So what phrase should we use to try and get that across to these young people?
Well, I haven't looked at that. Now, I don't know whether there is a paragraph below it which explains that we want people to abide by the law. I mean, so I'm not going to give them a hard time about it. I haven't thought about the point. I think that my general point is let's articulate things in human context, because that way people get it, is my very simple soundbite. If there's somebody thoughtful articulating what it means in a way that people will learn, I'm all in favor of people learning that no law is a nightmare. Law may not be perfect, and work at making it better. But I totally take your point. If it's sort of left at that and you've just got to learn the rule of law is a good thing, I don't think it takes you that far.
Jack, last one, then I'll ask one.
Hello again.
Hello again.
Jack Nelson, very unimportant person. The UK law has really confused me for the last 60 odd years. You've got UK law, Scottish law, etc., etc. Now then, I'm not getting in a political debate here, but you could have an offence in Scotland, go and see the sheriff, and the ruling will be whatever it is. You do the same offence in the UK, circuit judge, magistrates, you'll get a ruling for that. They're totally different. And then if you disagree with that, you decide, well, I'll appeal that. Off you go to Europe, to the Strasbourg, and they overturn everything the Brits and the Scots have done. Now that, in my opinion, is as the gentleman said earlier, it gets so confusing, the whole thing.
I'm going to steer clear of the B.
Oh.
Just because everybody has different views on it, I think that the point about complexity of regulation is a real challenge, is one of the points I'm trying to make, and I agree with your point on that. I'm very nervous about, take the England-Scotland issue. You know, we can always centralise everything. You know, some people would say, probably me included, that the culture of centralisation and making everything conform to one standard, which has been mainly around the southeast over the last 40 years, is arguably not the best thing this country has done. So if you standardise everything, there may be advantages, but you're reducing the power of different people, different societies, different communities to differentiate how they do things. And I'm cautious about doing that. I quite like the idea that we don't have everything rise to some high level in the centre that is so removed from everybody that nobody has a clue what its real impact is. So, look, I think that EU law, as it applies, and if we leave the EU, which we're clearly on track to do, we will have a whole load of laws that reflect the trade commitments that we give, because English law needs to honour trade commitments, so we'll have a lot of law to reflect that anyway. But obviously, the EU courts have, on those matters where the UK has agreed by its membership that jurisdiction is given to the EU, those matters do go to the European Court of Justice. That's absolutely right. It is another layer on issues which we agreed the EU would have jurisdiction on. And of course, it makes it more remote, and it is different again, I agree. But that's the deal everyone did, and may soon not have done. So we'll see.
James, can I ask you the last question? And it really focuses around whether it's ever justifiable to break the law. And I'm looking at my secretary and registrar as she hides under the seat, because I'm going to incriminate myself in this. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Act, was introduced. It required us, for data which we held on alumni as the example, to seek our alumni to opt in if we wished to send them newsletters and so on. Instantly, this university went from having 110,000 contactable alumni to having 8,000 contactable alumni. Now, I don't believe that the Act was set up for that purpose, but that is one of the unintended consequences of it. They no longer get their newsletter. Should I ignore it?
It's pretty tempting to get him into a lot of trouble, isn't it? Look, I think that it comes back to complexity again, and I think that we've got a lot of law that is so complicated and is driven to timetables that that's not a unique problem. I mean, in our organisation, we've had to do exactly the same. Just to step back, I think there are some pretty strong arguments that something like GDPR is a very important social good, unless you may be one of those, be people here who think tech companies should be able to access any data whatsoever, but I'm not one of those. And so I think some control is needed, and how you formulate it, of course, is then getting into judgment and is quite complicated, because how do you legislate for your use without also opening the gates for other uses? And that's sort of my point about balancing the good and the bad. I'm not going to give you a complete green light free opinion in public on a video recorder, but the reality is there has been guidance given by the Information Commissioner that they're not going to take enforcement action stupidly over things. I think there has been quite a lot of cautious lawyering about how to interpret GDPR, that fear of a mistake, that fear of somebody coming down on you. I think what is a reasonable use, what is evidence of consent. We had some debates on that internally, and we might have taken a slightly more robust view on what the law allows, but I've got a whole load of specialist technology lawyers who can look at it. But it's a good example of those tensions. I think the reason I raised the example of Nazi Germany is to force people to think about the answer to your question in a much more extreme context. My view in this country at the moment is we should try not to break the law, because if we start breaking the law, then how do we justify enforcing the law when we want to?
Yeah. James, thank you very much. Now, it's a great pleasure of mine to invite Suzy Harvey, our High Sheriff, to come and give a vote of thanks. Suzy, please.
Thank you very much, Quentin, and thank you, James. When I first met you, we've said more than 25 years ago, but we don't sort of dwell on that. Who knew we'd be standing on a stage together? I actually have a scientific background. I don't have a legal background at all, which was why I took myself back to university, as James mentioned, and did a master's in criminology. And I think I didn't do it to increase my knowledge of the law. I did it because I was kind of scared of talking to all the judges, some of whom are sitting in the audience today, and trying to sound knowledgeable about the massive scope of law. In fact, they're all such lovely people. I don't know why I was scared, so that has never been an issue. But it's very, as a scientist, I quite like the fact that you've said the law is about fairness and human trust. That's all we need to think about it. But that's all I like. I like bullet points. It's perfect. And the other thing is that laws and lawyers are imperfect. Perfect. We're all imperfect. That's great. Lastly, I'm very impressed that although you say that it's very important for people to think about their self-worth, it's obviously vital. It's interesting that your slides were of Tom Cruise, Colin Firth, and Paul Newman. So that is obviously how you view yourself.
I was trying to find some counterfactual there, but anyway. Certainly don't think my wife thinks, as you know, that that's the case.
She didn't feed that line to me either way.
No, I knew that.
And lastly, it's okay to make mistakes. And I think that's one of the great points I would take from tonight. It's okay to make a mistake, own up to it, and move on. And also accept that other people do it, and say, okay, you've learned from that, and so we go on. So thank you so much, James. Really, really kind of you. I was thrilled that I could have not only somebody who's a great friend and I've known for a long time to help me on this year of discovery for me. I've learned a lot. And it's been a wonderful evening, so thank you very much.
Thank you.